Hello friends, welcome back. Thank you for joining me for a very special video. Today we're going to be discussing 10 of the most common misconceptions about medieval clothing. As a reenactor who likes to do events where I get to talk to people from all different walks of life, I hear many assertions about medieval clothing, and some are more common than others. Of these common assertions, an unfortunate number are factually inaccurate. So I think it's time to dispel the top 10 misconceptions about medieval clothing once and for all. And to help me do that, I recruited the Turnip of Terror. So I'm going to let him get started with number 10.
Hello Ylva, and thank you for having me on. I have to say, I'm very excited to be here because myth busting is one of my favorite things about studying history. And I'm going to get us started off here with sumptuary laws, and this notion that everyone strictly adhered and conformed to the sumptuary laws as passed and written in various nations. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of how people tend to respond to legislated morality. The sumptuary laws were meant to fix a problem which already existed. Namely, those who were not noble were starting to afford to dress in a way which made them visually indistinguishable from the nobility. Now, people didn't stop doing that just because there was a fine associated with it. Some did, but there are also accounts of the financial penalty being proof of wealth as much as the outfit itself. Not only can I afford these clothes, but I can afford the fine for wearing them as well. People found as many ways to subvert the rules as well, as you can imagine. One example being using brighter brass for fittings to emulate gold. The visual difference defined in the sumptuary law did not exist because people naturally followed them. They were written that way because people didn't.
Number 9, Tyrion Purple. We've all heard this one, that purple was for royalty only, that the emperor could have you executed for having only a little bit of this dye on you. Generalizations like this are a little bit tricky. On one hand, they're not technically factually inaccurate, but on the other hand, they're leaving out so much context as to be misleading. Murex purple, or Tyrion purple, is a specific dye made with a certain gland from sea snails. This is the purple that we think of when we think of kings and emperors. It's also not always actually purple, but that's a story for another video. There are, however, other ways of obtaining purple that you won't lose your head for. Some lichens produce a purple dye called ochre, and this was used in at least the British Isles from the early medieval period right up into the 19th century. Of course, there is one other way of obtaining purple, whereby you dye a piece of fabric red and then you over-dye it with blue. There are a number of ways of obtaining purple that's not Tyrion purple.
Number 8. Pants or baggy fitting hose. With only a few known exceptions, people did not wear baggy, loose-fitting trousers. Though there are some cultures who did wear trews and trouser-like garments, the progression of European fashion started with longer tunics and robes. Then as the tunics got shorter, the preference was to take tight-fitting lower leg garments and have them travel up the leg following the same tight-fitting aesthetic. In most early medieval cultures, although not all, the technical requirements both in fabric and development of patterning did not lend themselves to pants, especially ones that fit as tight around the groin and waist as they would want or were able to do around the legs. So instead of a pair of pants being joined in the middle, you have two separate tight-fitting chausses. A looser boxer-style garment called braise covered the crotch and seat. And it was not until very late in the medieval era these pants became one garment from waist to ankle. And it was long after the Renaissance when loose-fitting pants with legs that were not tight-fitting became fashionable.
Number 7. Yellow hoods for hookers. The idea that prostitutes were forced to wear yellow hoods to mark them as social outcasts is an unfortunately prevalent misconception. The truth is far more complicated, of course. Sumptuary laws varied from place to place, and as a result, what prostitutes were required to wear varied likewise. As a general rule of thumb, no matter the location, a prostitute was probably not allowed to wear jewels, embroidery, furs, or anything else that moved them up the social ladder. They also weren't allowed to pretend that they had more status than they did, but this rule likely applied to most women across the board. Things that they might have been obliged to wear varied greatly. Some examples of these things might have included striped clothing, such as hoods, caps and hats of specific colours, armbands of specific designations, or bells. The idea that yellow was associated with prostitution may have come from these regional laws, or it may have come from the fact that yellow dye is very easy to produce, and so yellow may not have been seen as a high status colour.
Number 6, wearing only one layer or just effectively your underwear. See, many people think that when you put on a medieval looking shirt, you're done. Notwithstanding the mini ice age the world was going through, during which the medieval era was cold, and for all their positive qualities, natural fibers are not performance fabric. And there's only so much a thin layer of linen or wool is going to protect the body from the weather, compared to a similar thickness of, say, Gore-Tex. Thicker fabrics were more costly to produce and less versatile when layering, since actual layering gives you the ability to regulate your temperature throughout the day by removing or adding. As such, regardless of the era being interpreted, putting on a tunic and being done is always being underdressed. Medieval wardrobes not only are more comfortable, but they fit more correctly when worn as designed, which means you wear a shirt under a tunic or a coat, you wear a shift under your dress, and you wear gowns and robes and cloaks and things over the top of those.
Number 5. Black was impossible. To say that black was not a possible colour in the medieval period is not only misleading, it's factually inaccurate. It might be slightly harder to get historical black dyes to stick to modern bleached white wool, and they do tend to fade to grey a little bit faster than we'd like. These bleached white wools are not what the historical medieval dyer would have had available to them. When we think of sheep today, we generally jump to the idea of fluffy cream-coloured sheep, but there are also grey sheep and brown sheep, and some of these grey and brown fleeces naturally occur quite dark. If we try to dye these dark fleeces the same way we would dye a light fleece, we would get far closer to what we conventionally think of as black. This of course doesn't mean it was the most common colour, but what it does mean is that we shouldn't dismiss black out of hand as a colour possible for the medieval period. Instead, what we should do is look to the wider context to see if it's appropriate for our impression.
Number 4, people were slung with multiple belts and pouches. Perhaps it's an influence of the Wild West gunslinger film genre, or sword and sorcery style fantasy, or it's a conspiracy of belt and pouch merchants at Renfests. But the medieval person was not bedecked and festooned with multiple belts and pouches, and they certainly didn't dangle everything they owned from their belt. One of the few exceptions is when someone is in armor, they may sometimes have 2 belts, but this tends to be one ornamental plaque belt plus a sword belt. The typical medieval peasant worked the local fields. They were near their home all day. They had no more need to carry the kitchen sink on their belt as you would need to fill your pockets with everything from your kitchen cabinet just to go down to the store. At most, they would have a pouch, maybe a scrip or a sack to carry anything else prior to the development in shape and function of what we would consider a modern backpack.
Number 3. Turn shoes are uncomfortable. The idea that historical shoes are uncomfortable compared to modern shoes is a notion that I face at basically every reenactment event I go to. The thought that maybe only 1 or 2 layers of leather separates my foot from the ground is utterly bizarre to some people. While it is true that yes, there are some differences between modern and historical shoes, they're not that many. I will probably end up on my rear if I attempt to walk a steep grassy hill still covered in the morning's dew because my soles are far smoother than modern hiking shoes, for example. I also need to ensure to waterproof my shoes regularly. But are they uncomfortable? No. It's my observation that you wouldn't find historical shoes any more uncomfortable than, say, modern ballet flats. My go-to shoes are my Viking shoes. I wear them practically every single time I leave the house, and I've had them for the better part of 3 years. I haven't had to tie my shoelaces in nearly as long because these shoes have toggles, and that just saves so much time. Now, I'm not saying you would need to wear historical shoes every single day as well, but I think you could do away with the notion that historical shoes are uncomfortable.
Number 2, wool sucks. When we talk as a community about authentic fabrics, we usually refer to linen and wool. Wool was a major export of places like England, and there were certain breeds of sheep whose fleece were considered a national secret. Think of the medieval merino wool, which was prohibited from export by the Spanish crown. Of course, that just meant that it was obscenely expensive to get, not that it was impossible to find. The problem comes in when people have never worn proper wool and they worry about wool being coarse or itchy and hot. In reality, some of your favorite dress suits may be made from wool. And though it may have been less refined in the past, it's not impossible to make wool fabric in various weights and levels of fineness. Owing to its moisture-wicking properties, wool can be not only just as comfortable, but even more comfortable than some modern cottons and polyester. And that's all I have for you today. Ylva will take you down the home stretch.
Number 1, the absolute worst misconception about medieval clothing, that we had boring colours. If you've been watching a while, you know this is a pet peeve of mine. Hollywood tends to put a filter over most medieval themed films that have people of all walks of life portrayed as wearing drab and dreary greys, browns and blacks. Don't get me wrong, I'm as big a fan of all 7 series of Game of Thrones as the next person. Yes, I said 7, don't come at me. But with only a few exceptions, they're all really dull when it comes to the colour palette. For one of the closest to accurate colour palettes I have ever seen in Hollywood, check out Romeo and Juliet, the 1968 version, directed by Franco Zeffirelli. While yes, those greys and browns that you see from Hollywood's offerings would have been used in the medieval period, they probably would have been just as common as any other colour achievable by the medieval dyer. We know that medieval society was filled with reds, blues, yellows, greens and every colour in between, so don't let Hollywood fool you. So that's it, folks, the top 10 misconceptions about medieval clothing. Thank you very much to the Turnip of Terror for being a part of this video.
Thank you for having me on the channel. See you next time.
If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and feel free to head over to the Turnip of Terror's channel where we did a video collaborating together on the top 10 must-haves of medieval clothing. I'll leave a link for that in the description down below. So what did you think? Have you heard all these misconceptions before? Have you heard other misconceptions that we didn't cover here? Leave all those thoughts down in the comments below. I will be chatting to you down there, but that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. Bye for now. I think that's a take. Gonna do it one more time, just in case. To have any... Just say it. Just say it. You know what you gotta say. Brie, unlike modern hiking shoes. I stumbled on hiking? That was a good take. Was to wear yellow hoods to mark them. Oh my god, cars. Then I completely brain froze on that. If you ooh, we skipped ahead there. We skipped ahead a lot. That's not the words.